The events of the last few weeks have been quite startling, really. And when we think about it, it was only a couple of months ago when many people were saying Happy New Year to each other. But of course, it's been anything than that, particularly up in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think for all of us, there's a level of uncertainty that sort of encapsulates our world, because we realise, even though we live down here in Australia, the events that happen up in the Northern Hemisphere have an impact upon our lives as well. And of course, you would have heard just through the media that today we enter into the third year of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, 731 days. And it's quite surprising because initially Russia felt that, well, this is going to be a very quick move into Ukraine, problem solved. And it's gone on for 2 years, we're into 3 years now, and it's got more and more complex. So what I'm saying is this is not an unrelated event. Sometimes when we think the events that are happening up in the Northern Hemisphere are disconnected from ourselves, but of course we're interconnected with a lot of aspects as far as economy is concerned, finance, energy, food resources. What happens in another country does affect us as well. But I think while we're reflecting on this uncertainty of today's world, which has already been prophesied in Luke 21, not our subject tonight, we might be wondering why, as a community of Christadelphians, we don't focus on, well, good social works, and why we don't spend our time talking about faith, hope and love and building up of families. Why do we delve into the world of politics, particularly in Bible prophecy? And there's a reason for that, because we believe the Bible has a core element of hope for all of us, that despite how uncertain this world looks at the present time, the Bible tells us why these things are happening and how they're going to change. And that's something that we want to explore tonight. No commentator, no political journalist has ever predicted the events of the world as far as the Bible is concerned. We're looking at a prophecy here in Ezekiel 38 that's 2,500 years old. And it's accurately predicted what we're seeing unfold in our world today. So that is quite amazing. So the Bible tells us why this strife is happening and how God is going to remedy this particular problem. And it finishes with a picture of hope. And that's where we want to finish off tonight, with giving you an invitation to explore the Bible a little bit more, because it is very valid to today's world. So I think we've got, a few big questions that we have to answer. Beyond the little bubble that we live in, there are some big questions about the world that we need to answer. For example, the events of my world appear to be senseless and random actions by some nations. Why are they happening? Are these events somehow connected, or do they lead on a particular pathway? Will things on earth get better or worse? I mean, for all of us, we want to see a better world for our kids, for our grandkids, as well, for future generations. Is that possible? Because it doesn't look like it's possible the way the world is heading. Will global violence ever end? What's it going to take to cease? What impact will international events have for me and my family? So you see, we're taking these questions and we're thinking about them ourselves. How do the events that we see in the Middle East, and particularly in Europe this afternoon that we're going to have a look on, how do they impact, and what is the relevance? And the big question is God in control in the world? Because it doesn't look, the way nations are behaving, that there's any control. So the thing is, we place a lot of reliability upon the Bible because it's a valid faith. Often we refer to Daniel chapter 2. If you've been to a Christadelphian lecture before, we refer to the image of Daniel chapter 2, a historical image that starts with the Empire of Babylon and works all through to fragmented Europe. And those historical events have come to pass. These great empires have come into positions of power and, of course, have moved aside, and other empires have replaced them. Daniel chapter 2 is a phenomenal prophecy. Again, not our subject tonight. Ezekiel chapter 37, which is the chapter before we read, is again another phenomenal prophecy that talks about the return of Israel back to their land. And that's something we've seen happen as well. So what we're saying is there's substantial prophecies in the Bible that forecast events that will lead eventually to the return of Jesus Christ and the ultimate salvation of our world. And that's what we want to put forward to you tonight, so that we can have confidence in the message of the Bible. So our question tonight is, where is all this headed? When we look at world events, when we look at the approach of Putin to world politics, how autocratic he is with his decisions, he doesn't care about what anyone else thinks. Where is this all going to end? And many commentators have said, and I think we'll have a few clips, one of them says, you know what, maybe 2022 is the beginning of World War III and we didn't realise it. So he said historians are going to write perhaps that 2022, Russia's invasion, eventually triggered World War III. And we're seeing that funnel down into some tremendous pressure in the last few weeks. So the events, of course, in the Middle East in previous times, we're focused on Iran, we're focused on Iraq, Syria, Israel. They're all powder kegs ready to go up. There's a lot of tension there. But it's quite obvious if you've seen any media presentations, as far as the news is concerned, the problem is the country of Russia, isn't it? The greatest threat to world peace is Russia. We don't even have to turn to our Bible to show that. You can just look at your media presentations and the news. Russia is in the news every single day. And there's worldwide resistance now to the direction that Mr. Putin is taking. And as we've said, it's very evident he just disregards completely any resistance from Western nations in order to achieve his goal. Well, I wonder what is his goal. We'll uncover that tonight. So our big question is, will the events that we see happening in today's world, and particularly the aggression of Russia, will that ever end? Or is it going to be World War III? So let's unpack a little bit of Ezekiel chapter 38, because this is a particularly important chapter. And I know we only had a short reading, but this is the framework, just to give you a bit of a snapshot. If you've never seen Ezekiel 38, this is what it's all about. It talks about some aggressors at the beginning. There's going to be a big military alliance headed by a leader called Gog. And that Hebrew word just means one at the top, one ruler, a chief. It talks about when the time period is going to happen, and we'll just unpack that in another overhead a little bit later. Like, is Ezekiel 38, has that been fulfilled? It's a prophecy 2,500 years ago. Has it happened, or is it still to happen? Where are we? Who's involved in that? Who are going to be the defenders of the Middle East in this particular invasion that Ezekiel 38 talks about? What is the ultimate plan? If there's an invasion into the Middle East, what's the outcome? What is the design of it all? And beautifully and wonderfully, right at the end, this prophecy predicts that God is going to interrupt in the presence of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. He's going to save Israel and eventually bring peace to the world. So there's a good message tonight that we want to sort of include as we look at some of the aggressive policies of Russia. So our first question is, when is this going to happen? We're looking at Ezekiel 38. When is it going to happen? Are there any clues in Ezekiel 38 as to when this will happen? Well, Daniel chapter 2 referred to talks about the latter days. And it talks about an image, and it talks about a fragmented power of iron and clay, which represents basically the nations of Europe that we see today, and that's described as the latter days. And again, good colouring in exercise is to colour in those little time markers after many days in the latter years, in that day, latter day, same time in that day, and connect it to Daniel 2:28 and Isaiah 2 verse 2, because you can see from that reference there that Daniel chapter 2 is talking about the return of Jesus Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom. We have not seen that. So that's the connecting point. And Isaiah 2 talks about a place, international place of administration and prayer and education that will be established in Jerusalem. He uses that same phrase, in the latter days, in the last days. So again, here's a connectedness to all these prophecies that indicate Ezekiel 38 happens in the latter days. We're going to suggest, well, that's the time period that we're living in as well. Second question is, well, where is it going to, where is this going to happen? I mean, it's fairly obvious, but there's a really unique description that's contained in Ezekiel 38. It says, you'll come against the mountains of Israel. Where is that? Well, there's an additional clue. The people that are gathered out of many nations. 1948, the return of the Jewish people to Israel. And again, right through this prophecy, so we have a geographical location. So know when it's going to happen, in the latter times, our times, end times, final times, and it's going to be centred in the land of Israel. Verse 8 particularly of Ezekiel 38 says the mountains of Israel. Now, we just read across that, but you know what? There's something very significant about that. Because back in 2011, I know this slide is not particularly good because I took it. That was before we had iPhones. This is when we had cameras. And it's not particularly good. But this was taken in Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. And it's where David Ben-Gurion pronounced the state of Israel. Now, I know you'll frown, you can't read. I can barely read it myself, but I just put it up there as visual evidence. It basically says that they didn't know what to call the new state. Suggested it be called Judea, suggested it be called West Palestine, suggested it be called Zion, and that's across here, Western Palestine. On May the 9th, 1948, one of the councillors suggested that. Eventually, it was decided to call it Israel. All right, and up here, oh, no, not yet, there's a letter from President Harry Truman of the USA congratulating the state of Israel. In fact, he's got here the new Jewish state. He's actually crossed that out and renamed it the state of Israel, because in the last moments, hours before the pronouncement, it was decided to call it Israel. And that, I think, is just amazing, because here we have a prophecy against the mountains of Israel. And as we know, that was an amazing fulfillment after many, many prophecies that the state of Israel, particularly Ezekiel 37, will be re-established. So we often read, the word Israel here. We know Israel because it exists. But that in itself is a unique fulfillment of prophecy. So we've got the time period, we've got the location. Who now is this opposing power in Ezekiel chapter 38? Well, we get some clues, and this is what we want to uncover. Verse 15 and chapter 39, verse 2 says, "You will come out of your place from the north, and you have a great company, well armed, lots of weapons and munitions." So we just simply are saying, well, it's from the north. Where Ezekiel was, he was in the land of Israel. So we go north and we can establish generally who this opposing power will be. In fact, a couple of other translations say from the uttermost parts of the north. God's word says from the far north. So if we draw a line, of course, straight up from Israel to the uttermost parts of the north, it's pretty obviously where we're going to go, right? It's the area of Russia. So when we look at verse 2 of Ezekiel chapter 38, it talks about Gog of the land of Magog, prince of Russia, Meshech and Tobolsky. So there's some evidence there that is quite interesting for us as well, to the north. Now, I just painted that in vague terms. We'll add a bit of colour to it as we go through our lecture this evening. So can we drill down a little bit more and find out about this power? Well, yes, we can. There in verse 2 and 3, we have a description of Gog, the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. So, don't want to bore you with history, but I'm just going to add some validity to who is this Rosh. So here in Gesenius, who is a well-reputed Hebrew lexicographer, he makes this particular statement. A proper name of a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshech, and he says undoubtedly the Russians, who are mentioned in the Byzantine times by the name of Rus. Okay? So we're drawing a very interesting picture of a prophecy that was given 2,500 years ago that says there will be an extremely definitive power to the north of Israel that will invade into the Middle East. So that's where we are at the moment. And of course, we can paint that particular area there. This is Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. I'm going to add some more evidence in. Samuel Bocart, who's sort of in the 15th, 16th century, talks about the names Rosh here, which he identifies as Rosh and Russia. There's reams of information. Talking about AI, I thought a couple of days ago, I'm going to give AI, artificial intelligence, to those that don't know what I'm saying, artificial intelligence, I'm going to give this a go and say, where is Russia called historically in some previous writings? Where is Ross identified with Russia? And it just came up with a stream of names. Charles Ryrie. Now, some of you may have a study Bible by this particular translator. He notes that and concludes that Rosh refers to Russia. So there we have it in verse 2. Chief Prince or Prince of Rosh. We got all these writers here. It just kept flowing up with key historians and scholars as well. So all these people, so this is not some unique Christadelphian doctrine. This is not something we've invented. There are numerous people, historians, and as well as that, archaeologists who clearly identify this particular prophecy as connected with Russia. I know that's a lot of evidence, but we need to move on. So this particular writer, Clyde Billington, he's a very well-known archaeologist. So not only is he a Bible student, but he digs around in the dirt, in the stones, and connects ancient civilizations. So well reputed. And again, he talks about the Rosh people of Ezekiel 38, the Russians of Europe. They're known as the Russians. So I'm not proving this by the Bible. I'm going to external sources, bringing in historians and scholars and Hebrew lexicographers, and they all say the same thing, which is pretty interesting. Now, to top it off, just to put the icing on the cake, I'm going to refer to the ultimate person to define who Ross is. Well, it's Mr. Putin himself. He wrote back in 2021, which is only a couple of years ago, a historical paper on the Russians. And here he says we're all descendants of ancient Rus. And he wrote that, and he identifies the modern day Russia as the ancient descendants of Rosh, or Rush, which is in our Bible here. Pretty interesting, right? So here, of course, even if the historians have got it wrong, let's just take all the evidence I've given you and throw it to one side, say, well, maybe. And now we'll come back to the narrative just to add some more evidence. It simply says from the north. So even if the Hebrew scribes are wrong about their language and the Russian historians are wrong and Putin got it all wrong and everyone else got it wrong, it's clear the reference to the land of Gog and Magog include Meshech and Tubal, which is directly in the same area north. So geographically, that's where we've got to head. Now, what's interesting is not only is Russia identified, this is termed in verse 2, Magog. Who's that? Well, here again, we're going to refer to Herodotus, a well-known historian, right back in 450 BC. All right, so a few hundred years after this prophecy was written. And he relates them to the Scythians, given by the Greeks, an ancient people who spread themselves to the river Tanis, or Don, and the Danube. So here is the Danube, here is the Don. This is the ancient area of Magog right there, the Scythians, which is pretty interesting because right here we have the area of Ukraine. So that's the ancient area of Magog as well. Another writer said, Scythia, the land of Magog, is what we would call Ukraine and southern Russia. Indeed, some think that the descendants of the Scythians can still be identified in this area at the moment. So that's sort of pretty interesting. Looking at the events of the last 2 years, going into the third year, Russia wants to invade Ukraine, which will happen sometime. Whether that's in the immediate present or somewhere in the future, eventually Russia will take over that particular area. And associated with that, of course, when you look at Ezekiel 38, there's a whole group of people in verse 5 and 6. And we know these people, we know these countries. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, they're well-known countries. Goma, perhaps not so much, but the Gauls, Tagama, which is the area of Turkey. So when we look at this map of what Ezekiel 38 is presenting to us, you can see there's all the nations. We've just put them on the map there so you know where they sit and who they are. So they're easily and clearly identifiable today. And if we were just to sort of redraw the map, you notice there in the red, this is this big confederacy, which would be quite frightening and will be quite frightening. And of course, then we've got the opposing powers, which we're not going to deal with today, another subject, but essentially some Western powers that oppose this invasive force. So one of the things that we do note, of course, and we see it forming right now in our media, is the power and the might of Russia. Mr. Putin himself said the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest major geopolitical disaster. So if you know your history, back in 1989, 1990, the Berlin Wall came down and Russia fell apart. And the Western world was saying, well, you know, democracy is going to rule now. And that actually hasn't happened. While there are some European nations that have gained independence, of course, Mr. Putin is determined to re-establish the Russian Empire and to fulfill Bible prophecy, which is an amazing thing. So he characterises that as the worst disaster You can see the direction he's heading in. And a little cartoon here, which says, of course I'm hungry, I've been hibernating since 1991. So Russia was on the back foot. They're now moving forward. They've now got hold of Ukraine. We believe eventually, according to Bible prophecy, whether that's in the present or a bit later on, Russia will encompass that whole area. Now, I'm going to play you a couple of clips, and this gives an indication of where Russia is going.
You have an aggressive psychopath in the Kremlin with 6,500 nuclear weapons and a taste for blood. He invaded and annexed the Crimea in 2014. He got no response. He invaded and annexed parts of Georgia in 2008. He got no response. He assassinated people with chemical weapons in Britain, virtually no response. He shoots down an airliner, MH17, over Donetsk, no response.
Yeah, if you were sitting with of the war so far.
This is the most serious crisis humanity has ever faced. For 20 years, Putin has destroyed every single check and balance in Russia. He is clearly psychologically deranged. He's seriously deluded. He enjoys raising the possibility of nuclear war. His propagandists boast that he's more virile than Soviet leaders because he's prepared to wage nuclear war. We are in extreme danger.
We are at a really dangerous point in human history, probably the most dangerous since the end of the Second World War. And I wonder what future historians will write was 2022, the year that the Third World War began. All things are possible, including the very worst case scenarios.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
He is a Hitler with nuclear weapons.
So did you hear the last sentence? He's a Hitler with nuclear weapons. So this is a very frightening insight perhaps into someone that we don't know particularly well, because, well, it's right up in the Northern Hemisphere and we're down in the South. But to listen to some of these journalists and to understand how confronting they find Mr. Putin and his regime, and let me just sort of back up a little bit and say, I don't know if Mr. Putin's going to get assassinated tomorrow, and maybe he will, but his regime, his empire will continue on. And one of my last clips, it's going to be Mr. Putin himself saying, look, I might pass off the scene, but the empire will continue. And that's according, obviously, to Bible prophecy. So there's an interesting concept as far as Ezekiel 38. This man is determined, whoever it is, whether it's Mr. Putin or backing back the Russian Empire, to have world domination. You'll notice in verse 4 of Ezekiel 38, if you've got it there, it just says, I'm going to turn you back and put hooks in your jaws. Now, that's a really interesting statement because at the moment, Russia's focused on Europe, taking Ukraine. They're investing a lot of their resources in taking Ukraine. This prophecy says, I'm going to turn you around and send you into the Middle East. We don't know when that's going to happen. So there's going to be a reversal somewhere. Maybe Jesus will return and we won't ever, see that ourselves. But certainly there will be a reversal into the Middle East. And of course, it goes on to talk about your army, horses and horsemen, a great company. They've got all the weaponry, bucklers, shields, swords. Well, that's ancient terminology for all the weapons of war that we see today. So here again is this clear emphasis. I like to put in colour so you can sort of see how it jumps out of the chapter. Military forces, horses, fully armed, shields, swords, helmets, many are. You'll be their leaders. So this is a power that is building up as we speak its resources. Went into the war a little bit early, 2 years ago, and realised now and backing up, and now they have incredibly speed jumped their expenditure in the military. So here, Russian armed forces, one of the bigger forces. They've got a large stockpile of nuclear weapons. I was watching a report that was released by the CIA in America that they're concerned that Russia will launch a nuclear-based satellite into space that will give them the capability of knocking out your mobile phones, knocking out the internet, knocking out all pieces of information. So they're worried about that. Hasn't happened yet, but they're getting close to it. They've got their tanks, of course. They've been strengthening them. They've added in thermal optics to work during the night so they can see any incoming missiles as well. And This comment says Russia is essentially in a constant state of a hybrid warfare against NATO, and they employ all of these aspects, and we're sort of seeing that. So NATO at the moment is a little bit, well, they're worried. And if you've seen some of the reports, they're asking for money, they're trying to consolidate. And if you saw Mr. Trump a few weeks back, he made the statement, well, if the members of NATO aren't going to pay their bills, i.e. fund NATO, they're supposed to put 2% of their gross national product into NATO, Mr. Trump said, I don't care about them, let Russia invade them. They're not going to pay their bills, which I find pretty interesting because he'd just come out of the court and he'd been sued because he hadn't been paying his bills. But anyway, you know, his comment was, let NATO fall to pieces if they're not going to finance it themselves. We don't want to fund them. Well, that's all pretty interesting. And of course, so this talks about all their weapons that they've got. Well, again, that's...
Surely the most terrifying prospect facing Ukraine and the world is Vladimir Putin's apparent willingness to use the worst weapons of all. Putin recently put his nuclear arsenal on high alert. And as the world already knows, Russia has stockpiles of the deadly nerve agent Novichok and has shown no compunction using it in the past. In March 2018, Russian agents used Novichok in the UK in their attempt to murder a former spy.
Он просто подонок.
They turned the city of Salisbury into a chemical war zone.
It took us 18 months to decontaminate Salisbury for a quarter of an egg cup of this stuff.
Chemical weapons expert Hamish de Breton-Gordon lives in Salisbury and saw the devastation caused by Novichok, a deadly substance banned by international treaty.
It took 13,000 hours, 37 vehicles were buried or destroyed, and tons of rubble were taken away from Salisbury.
If he's prepared to use nuclear weapons, he's probably prepared to use almost any weapons. And I've seen chemical weapons used extensively in Syria, and that is something that we need to be really concerned about.
Putin's propaganda has trumpeted its so-called mother of all bombs, the most powerful non-nuclear explosive ever created. And there are reports this terrifying weapon has already been used in Ukraine.
So you just get a viewpoint of some of the capabilities that Russia has. First time, I believe their hypersonic missile has been used. It's a hypersonic missile, it fires at 5 times the speed of sound. There's no known technology that can stop it. They've got a thermobaric bomb. It's like a vacuum bomb, has 2 parts. It releases a cloud, and then it has a second charge that just detonates that, and it just sucks all the oxygen out of the air and vaporises body. So it basically leaves the buildings there, or the resource there, and just removes all the human life. So some pretty powerful stuff. And this is what Ezekiel 38 is talking about. It's a nation that has been military geared, and we're seeing that today. Now, Ezekiel 38 goes on, another little interesting comment in verse 7. It says, you'll be prepared. Well, we're seeing that right now. It's ratcheting up its military expenditure. And prepare for yourself and all the company that are assembled under thee, and be a guard. Now, you notice that little statement there at the end? Be a guard. What does that mean? Well, interesting comment, because here it talks about a historical writer who said that the Russian Empire wants to reach a point where they become a guard to the whole of Europe. But more than that, she becomes a protectorate. And this writer, a Christadelphian writer back in 1884, it's a long time ago, said she's to vanquish many countries and hold a protectorate over them, from Ezekiel 38. These countries include all the nations of the continent. We've talked about those, to embrace nearly every country in Europe, and of course to achieve universal dominion. So I'm going to show you some clips where Putin clearly says, my plan is not simply to take Ukraine, it is to expand the Russian Empire. So again, quite amazing comments as far as Mr. Putin is concerned. So this word prepare, we're seeing that happen. It basically means to be very confident. And we'd ask the question, is Russia confident in the position they're taking? Absolutely. Mr. Putin has an election coming up in 2 weeks' time, in March. He's got an election coming up in 2 weeks' time. Funny, all the other candidates seem to be disappearing. They're either falling out of planes or being pushed out of a window or being poisoned. So he's going for another 6-year term. So, you know, he has very clear designs on where he wants to go. And here's this comment about this word guard, which is a particularly interesting Hebrew word. Usually it means to protect or defend. Not in this case. The Hebrew word is different. It means to act as a prison guard or to hold in custody. So where we see that word guard, it basically means take control of those nations and put them in prison. So there's none of those European nations. Poland is ramping up its military force to become the most powerful force because they think they're next and they're worried about where Russia's going to go. And of course, well, there's a comment there. They want to run the world. So we're looking at Western powers trying to reinforce Ukraine. We're looking at Russia coming down. It's a face-off. Russia's got, let me tell you, from Bible prophecy, Russia's got bigger ambitions than just Ukraine. It's what we're reading about. In fact, if we read on in Ezekiel chapter 38, you'll notice it says this. You're going to come like a storm, like a cloud. There's going to be many people. You're just going to invade. Now, Russia's learning its lesson about Ukraine. Thought it could go in with a small force and win the victory. Found they can't. So they're ramping up their expenditure in their military forces because one day they're going to come down into the Middle East and it's going to be decisive and quick. That's what Ezekiel 38 says. And so we've got a lot of newspaper headings now that are quite worried. Vladimir Zelensky is going all around the world pleading for checks, pleading for money. Ukraine has run out of ammunition. That's what I'm seeing coming through. They've run out of ammunition because all the Western powers were cleaning out their old warehouses and sending all the old ammunition or the old tanks and everything they want to clear out to Ukraine. And now they're finding, well, we've got to reinforce it with more. So now Verni's death, you know, quite brazen, quite open, happened a few days ago. Mr. Putin doesn't care less. There's an appeal there. Please stop. Well, he's not going to stop at all. In fact, this report here says he's got a 9-stage report and timeline that he's released. Now, the German Ministry of Defence leaked this document. And this document is Mr. Putin's plan to hit NATO. And here it is here. I don't know if this is going to happen, but leaked documents from the German Ministry of Defence. This is not some media team trying to hype up the events that are happening. This is the German Ministry of Defence. They say, here's a leaked document. Mr. Putin actually has a plan in place, and here's the timeline. Now, whether that timeline's going to happen, you know, who knows? But that's the purpose that he has. So, a very weak resistance from the Western nations, really.
Behaviour in the 21st century, and NATO must stand firm against Russia, because if we don't, then Russia will continue to do this in other parts of Europe.
But what will the West do?
To press on with tightening the economic vice around Vladimir Putin.
Will we confront Putin?
Because we've been weak and we have not stood up to Putin over the last 10 years, he has got some deranged idea that he can act like some modern-day Hitler to take Ukraine against its will. And we cannot, as a moral, free world, allow that to happen.
Time has come to change this.
The first mark of a tyrant is his willingness to lie to the world without caring that he will be unmasked. For months and weeks leading up to his invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin swore it was all propaganda from the United States and the West.
По поводу, хотим мы этого или нет? Конечно, нет.
Even now, weeks into what clearly is an invasion, his ministers claim they have not.
Мы на Украину не нападали. На Украине мы просто...
So there's Mr. Putin, of course, invaded Ukraine. He says he didn't want to do it. It's a strategic attack to help defend his own people. And we know that's not the truth at all. But what's interesting is at the beginning of the clip, they said the Western world, they haven't done enough. They haven't been strong enough. So if you remember, if you wind back 2 years, remember when the Western powers were saying, we're going to put sanctions in place. They're going to be swift. They're going to be decisive. They're going to decimate Russia. We're going to put intense pressure. You know what? Russia is actually making more money now with the sanctions in place than they did before. In fact, Mr. Biden just stood up a couple of days ago and said, we put 500 more sanctions on Russia. I'm going to show you a clip now. You wonder where all that oil and gas is going. Remember the pipeline, Nord Stream 2? It's going to feed Europe and that stop. Where's all this oil and gas going? You know where it's going? It's actually going back to America. It's being resold to them. There's a couple of shots here. I'll show you the clip. There's ships that are loading and swapping gas and oil on the high seas and reselling it to the Western nations.
Crude oil tankers, sometimes engaged in opaque, secretive transfers. These two under sanctions busting suspicions in the past. The big one from Russia's Black Sea coast, transferring crude to the smaller one, which also came from Russia. Tens of millions of barrels of crude likely transferred like this last year. And where it ends up, often unclear, which is the point.
That's probably about 60 million barrels that are being transferred in the middle of the ocean purposefully. So you really needed to have a reason, because it's much easier not to do that.
Russia is richer than ever before. Last year's budget was $320 billion.
Oh yeah, where's the
About a third of which spent on its invasion of Ukraine. Sanctions were meant to dent oil paying for war, but instead, India has stepped in and is now buying 13 times more Russian crude oil than before the war, worth $37 billion last year, says one estimate exclusively given to CNN. But there's a complication for the West here, as India refines the oil and sells those products on. And the biggest buyer of products from Russian crude last year, according to exclusive new data obtained by CNN, the United States, over $1 billion worth from India. Way more if you add what US allies, also imposing sanctions on Russia, also import.
So we've seen an increase in 2023 of 44% of oil products that are being made from Russian crude oil flowing into those countries that impose sanctions on Russia, such as the US, UK and EU.
Putin earning money on the crude, probably the shipping, but also the refining and the resale.
So it's no wonder he's drinking champagne, because the so-called Western sanctions aren't even working. They're offloading their ships in the middle of the ocean, refining it in India and reselling it to either China or back into the West. So quite amazing. So Russia, isn't a problem when it comes to funding its military. But you notice in Ezekiel 38 as well, one of the reasons they go down into the Middle East is because of the resources. So you'll notice in verse 12 and 13, there's a question here as to why this Northern Confederacy comes in the Middle East. And look at verse 12, it's to take a spoil. They want to grab hold of some more resources. And again, it says that in verse 13, to take a spoil, silver, gold, cattle and goods. So that's why they come down to the Middle East. Now, we might ask the question, well, what's the Middle East got to offer Russia? Well, just a few years back, there's a game changer. Remember the gas they found off the coast of Israel? Absolute game changer, not only for Israel, but geopolitically for the Middle East and for Europe as well. So what Israel is doing, they found these massive gas fields. They're finding more, and in fact, there's areas that have been unexplored. So they're actually putting them up for bidders, because there's a massive resource there for this gas. And where's it going to go? Where's all this gas going to go? Well, you can look at the pipelines there. They're going to push it into Turkey, into Greece, into Italy, into Europe. Now, I wonder what Russia thinks about that. So, that's going to be an issue, and perhaps an incentive as to why, from our viewpoint here and now, maybe it'll change, but why this Northern Confederacy, Russia and the cohort, comes down into the Middle East. Game changer as far as Israel is concerned. They've shifted from oil to gas now, completely altered their power status. Israel is now very dominant in that particular area, and you'll see those newspaper headings coming up saying, well, options to get them back into Europe, because they're going to be still struggling to build up their reserves, fuel reserves. They're still struggling to that. And of course, Israel can provide that through pipelines. So it's a fulfillment really of Bible prophecy. And this is quite relevant when we look at Ezekiel chapter 38 as to the events and how they're happening and unfolding in today's world. Now, not only do we look at Ezekiel chapter 38, there's many Bible prophecies that say exactly the same thing. So I'm just going to bring another Bible prophecy into play, and there's a couple that we could do. We talk about profiling. You know, in the detective investigative world, we profile people. Well, here's the profile of whoever is at the helm, and maybe Mr. Putin or somebody else in that empire. Ezekiel 38 says they're going to be well armed, they're going to have a powerful influence, they're going to be aggressive, they're going to have ongoing interest in the Middle East, they want to increase their assets and their north. Well, that's Ezekiel 38. But you know what? We can line up, and we're not going to go there, Daniel chapter 11 as well. So these are two very powerful prophecies that simultaneously profile the Russian Empire and their bid for world domination. So you can, you know, go through all of that. Now, in recent times, the Ukrainians sent a drone in and blew up one of the Russian boats. And you'll notice here, this is from a headline, a furious Putin orders commanders to frontline after 74 sailors were killed in this Novochavasek, if that's how you say it, boat. So you can see the sort of the attitude of this man and the people that are behind him. Right? There's people possibly behind him as well that will come to the fore. So profiling, what's he really like?
Putin's regime surviving a dire political crisis, appearing more determined than ever to fight their war.
I'm extremely pessimistic, to be honest. I think that we are looking at probably 5-7 years of war.
So that clip I only got a couple of weeks ago, and he's saying another 5 to 7 years of
war. The world may have to deal with Putin's people and his killer instinct for a long time to come. Last year, lashed out at the world with unbridled bitterness, branding America an empire of lies, and launching the largest conflict on the European continent since the Second World War. And who has been accused of assassinating his opponents, despite his consistent denials. Russia's supposedly decisive leader often delays decisions or even changes his mind. Initially, he called the men who follow Prigozhin traitors.
Это удар по России, по нашему народу. И наши действия по защите Отечества от такой угрозы будут жесткие.
Then seemed to forgive them.
He fell out of a plane. Remember, he's the commander.
A figure shrouded in spin, the subject of endless speculation, but who is now wanted by the International Criminal Court for alleged Russian crimes in Ukraine, including the unlawful deportation of children. Putin, described over the years as devoid of emotion, has over time become consumed by a slow burning fury toward the West.
Наши западные коллеги, особенно из США, не просто устанавливают произвольно такие правила, но и поучают при этом, кто и как должен их исполнять, кто и как должен вообще себя вести. Вы кто такие вообще? Какое вы имеете право кого-то предупреждать?
When Russia attempted to influence America's presidential election, simultaneously launching a bloody intervention in Syria's civil war. Washington wanted Syria's dictator gone. Putin did not. Russia's message: anything you can do, we can do better. It marked perhaps President Putin's zenith on the world stage, a Russian leader with the upper hand over even America's president. Presidents Putin and Trump met in person at least 5 times, and every time amid a political storm, reaffirming Putin's perception that American power was in decline, emboldening him. President Putin seemed dominant, both diplomatically and in war.
So pretty interesting, even Mr. Trump, who's sort of brash and out there, Mr. Putin's sort of a couple of levels above him, and I'm not sure what the significance of passing him a soccer ball was, whether he thought Mr. Trump would be better on a soccer field than president, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, it's showing his power and his really aggressiveness, and he doesn't care about world opinion. So these events are quite interesting, whether we bring in Daniel, whether we bring in Ezekiel, all of them have a similar prophecy. So not only have we looked at historical evidence, not only we're looking at today's world, we're also looking at other prophecies in the Bible that have exactly the same message. So there are a number of additional prophecies, again, not our subject tonight, but you can see them there, Joel chapter 3, Micah 4, Daniel 11, Daniel 2. All these prophecies synchronise together to show that in the last days there will be a power that completely disregards the rest of the world and wants world domination. It's going to be interrupted by the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, we're not just getting on the bandwagon and saying, look at today's world, look at the Bible, it's coming to pass. Some of our earlier brothers, our Bible studiers, wrote concerning this event before Israel was even a nation, before Russia was a world power. And one writer said this in Help Us Israel: the future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times. They're predicted in the scriptures of truth. And from Ezekiel 38, the extraction was the Russian autocracy. And he describes himself, Putin describes himself as an autocrat, which is pretty amazing, a dominant ruler. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, let the reader know that the return of Jesus Christ is very close at hand. We're on the verge of that. We're on the edge of that. We're seeing Russia almost make that move. Hasn't made it yet, but we believe will very shortly. So, question is, where to next? Where to next on the world scene of politics? If you were a person in the world looking at world events, what would you think would be in play for next year and the year after? Well, these people say, while we can hope for the best, we've got to plan for the worst. Even if a peace deal is agreed, it'll be fragile. And several prominent dissidents believe it's possible his imperial ambitions go beyond the borders of Ukraine. Well, let me tell you, they do. Not from a political observation, but simply from a reading of God's word. We know that is absolute. Now, I'm going to look at this clip here. I want to back up and say, I'm not saying Mr. Putin is the leader of Russia and will invade the Middle East. There are people in the wings that will carry that forward for him if he's not on the scene. And he says that himself.
Russia is turning east. Putin and Xi open about their view that Western power is on the way.
Now notice what he's saying. We're changing the world. The last 100 years, both China and Russia are going to change the world. That's their belief.
Perhaps Putin's fascination and resentment towards the West are two sides of the same coin. Today, the resentment has won out. The way he tells it, he had no choice.
Если бы у вас была такая возможность, сказали бы Владимиру Путину образца 2000-го.
Что бы сказал? Я бы сказал, верной дорогой идете, товарищ.
So this is just last year. He's saying, what would you say to yourself 20 years ago?
Значит, от чего бы предупредил? От избыточной, от наивности и избыточной доверчивости в отношении наших так называемых партнеров.
There are looming questions for the future. For example, what happens when all those fighters return from war?
So
President Putin began his leadership
come
with
back
Russia
from
in
Ukraine.
turmoil.
Where are they going to go?
He leaves office, whenever and however that happens, what country will he leave behind?
Do you worry that the longer you are in power and without any sign of someone to replace you, the more instability there may be when you finally do choose to leave office?
Настолько связал всю свою судьбу с судьбой страны. Нет для меня в жизни нет никакой другой более значимой задачи, чем укрепление России. Поэтому, если любой другой человек, и я увижу, что какой-то человек, даже если он критически относится к каким-то сферам моей деятельности, но я увижу, что это человек с конструктивными взглядами, человек предан стране, готов положить на алтарь Отечества не просто годы, а всю свою жизнь. Ну, как бы он не относился ко мне лично, я сделаю все, чтобы такие люди были поддержаны. Когда-то, разумеется, это естественный процесс биологический. Когда-то нам всем будет замена. И вам на своем месте, мне на своем. Но я уверен, что фундаментальная основа российской государственности, российской экономики, политической системы будут такими, что она будет твердо стоять на ногах и уверенно смотреть в будущее.
But the Russia Putin leaves behind, molded in his image, with its army, nuclear weapons, and defiance, will be a challenge for the West for years to come.
Россия!
So that little comment, who are you going to leave behind? And he said someone with the same vigour to take the Russian Empire where it needs to be, standing on its feet. I almost thought of Nebuchadnezzar's image, the same description is used, that this image will eventually stand on its feet and will be brought low by the little stone out of the mountain, our Lord Jesus Christ. So quite an amazing prophecy. We're seeing all the jigsaw pieces on the table, in place, a few maybe to go into a particular spot. But Ezekiel chapter 38 is undoubtedly being unfolded before our eyes. It's amazing what we're seeing in today's world. But we don't want to leave it there on a negative note. We want to leave it on a positive note because the Bible has some answers. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all about a vicious end to the Middle East and Europe. It's about promises of hope. What are those promises? Well, there's a lot of prophecies in the Bible. Ezekiel 38, we haven't turned to all of them. Jerusalem retaken as a capital, seen that. Global anxiety, we're seeing that. Luke 17, a worldwide decline in morals. Hello, talk me about gender dysphoria and how people don't even know what their self-identity is these days. Daniel chapter 12, an increase in knowledge. Artificial intelligence, the internet streaming down. People just being overwhelmed by information. They shut down. And again, they're amazing changes. Joel chapter 3, North Korea, nations firing off missiles at each other saying we're strong. So they're causing havoc. Zechariah 12, Jerusalem, unsolvable. The Gaza, Palestinian, Israel situation. We haven't even dealt with that tonight. It's there in Zechariah chapter 12. They're all prophecies, Ezekiel 38 we have. These are all prophecies in the Bible that we're seeing either come to pass or have come to pass. So why would we think Ezekiel 38 is not going to come to pass? We've got a whole list of Bible prophecies that have ticked off. It's going to come to pass. So what can we leave with you? 7 amazing promises as well. God created this world for a purpose. He's going to fill it with his knowledge. God is going to set up a kingdom. He's going to send Jesus Christ back to the earth. The world's problems are going to be resolved by Jesus and the people that he brings into his administration. Ultimately, in Revelation 21, there's no more disease, mortality, sin, and you can be there. So this is the wonderful thing about the Bible. Not only does it talk about what's happening in today's world, it gives us an option to be with Christ and to renew this earth to the place that God designed it to be. I want to leave you this one last quote, and it comes from Peter. He says, concerning God and his patience, he says, the Lord isn't slow to do what he's promised. Ezekiel 38, one day is going to be fulfilled. But he's patient. He doesn't want to destroy anyone. He wants all people to have an opportunity to turn to him and change the way they think and act. That's you, that's me. We've got an opportunity before Jesus returns to recalibrate our lives. So we invite you, friends, thank you for coming along this afternoon. Hopefully it's been an education as to where Russia is eventually going to go, but also an additional hope in the return of Jesus Christ. Please consider your personal involvement and how you can benefit from exploring the Bible a little bit further and making your world a better world.